Are you quietly making a small mistake in intimacy that she never talks about, but still feels every single time? Not because she wants to blame you, not because she doesn't care, but because something has slowly changed and no one really explained it to you. And here's what surprises most men I speak to. Men over 50 are often not doing something wrong on purpose. They are simply repeating what once worked, what felt natural 20 or 30 years ago, when both bodies responded differently, faster, more predictably. But the reality is, her body today is not the same body it was back then. Especially after menopause, there are quiet but real physiological changes. Changes in sensitivity, in lubrication timing, in emotional connection to physical touch. And most men were never taught to recognize this shift, let alone adjust to it. A large observation published in Sexual Health Research showed something even more revealing. Around 67% of women over 50 admitted they have pretended to be satisfied during intimacy, not because they were unhappy with their partner, but because they didn't want to create pressure or make him feel like something is wrong. And that silence is dangerous in a very quiet way, because it doesn't create conflict. It creates distance. Slow, invisible distance that builds over months, sometimes years, without either person clearly noticing when it began. Now, as a doctor who has worked with many older couples over time, I want to be very clear with you. This is not a story about decline, and it is not about loss. It is about change. Natural, biological change. The kind that happens in every human body as it evolves with age. And once you understand that properly, not emotionally, but clinically and calmly, everything shifts. Because you stop guessing. You stop relying on old assumptions. And you start responding to what is actually happening in front of you in real time. What I am going to share with you today are 5 research-informed techniques. Simple adjustments, not complicated methods. Things that help you reconnect more precisely, more gently, and more effectively with your partner's current body and responses. These are designed specifically for men in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and beyond. Not to perform better, but to understand better. And I want you to stay with me, especially for technique number 4, because in clinical observation, this is the one most often missing in long-term relationships. And it is rarely about strength or experience. It is about timing and awareness. Before we begin, I often ask patients something simple. If you are comfortable, you can also reflect on it. Age doesn't matter here, just awareness does. Now let's begin with the first principle. Technique 1 is something most men underestimate completely. It is not about action first. It is about observation first. Reading her body before you try to guide anything physically. Because one of the most common patterns I see in older men is this. Their mind becomes slightly distracted in intimate moments. Not because they don't care, but because they are thinking. Thinking about performance. Thinking about expectations. Thinking about whether everything is going as it should. And the moment your attention leaves the present moment, you stop noticing the most important part of intimacy. Her response. Her body is constantly communicating, but not through words, through breath, through subtle movement, through small shifts in posture and touch, a slight change in how she holds you, a gentle adjustment in how close she stays. Even the rhythm of her breathing tells you more than any verbal feedback ever could. These are not random signals. Clinically speaking, they are feedback responses from the nervous system, guiding you, without language, toward what feels comfortable and what feels connected for her. And interestingly, research in sexual behavior studies has shown something very consistent. Men who stay physically and mentally present during intimacy, who pay attention to these subtle responses, report significantly better partner outcomes. Not because they are doing more, but because they are responding more accurately. When her body leans in, that is not accidental. When her breathing deepens, that is not random. When her grip changes slightly, that is communication. And when you learn to recognize this without overthinking it, something important happens. You stop guessing, and you start aligning with her experience in real time. This is the foundation of everything that comes next, because without this awareness, every other technique becomes mechanical. But with it, even small adjustments begin to feel naturally synchronized. And that is where real connection starts. Technique 1 doesn't end with observation alone. It naturally leads into understanding what those signals actually mean in real time. Because once you begin to notice her responses more clearly, the next step is not to act faster. It is to become more accurate in how you respond. Let me explain this carefully. When a woman is relaxed, comfortable, and emotionally engaged, her body shows it in subtle progression. Her breathing becomes more steady. Her muscles soften rather than tighten. Her movements become less guarded and more naturally responsive. These are not performance signs. They are physiological indicators of comfort and trust. On the other hand, when the body becomes slightly tense or when breathing loses rhythm, that is not something to ignore or push through. It is a signal that something needs to slow down or adjust. And this is where many older men unintentionally lose connection. Not because they lack ability, but because they continue with a fixed idea of what should happen next instead of adjusting to what is actually happening. Presence is not just noticing her body once. It is continuously updating your understanding of her response every few seconds. And when you begin to do that, something very important changes. You are no longer performing a routine. You are participating in a living, responsive interaction. Now, once this awareness becomes part of your natural behavior, we move into the second principle. Technique 2 is often where the biggest transformation happens, especially for men over 50. It is about pace. And I want to be very direct here. Most men underestimate how much timing and speed affect a woman's physical response at this stage of life. There is a common assumption that experience alone is enough. But biology does not respond to assumptions. It responds to conditions. After menopause, the body does not instantly respond the way it once did in earlier years. There is a measurable change in how quickly the body becomes fully ready for deeper physical intimacy. This is not a problem. It is a physiological reality. In clinical studies on sexual response in older women, researchers consistently observe that the body often requires a longer warm-up phase, not because something is wrong, but because hormonal shifts naturally change responsiveness and timing. Yet, what happens in many long-term relationships is simple. The emotional familiarity creates confidence, but that confidence sometimes leads to rushing physical progression. Not intentionally, but habitually, and here's the key issue. When pace increases too quickly, before the body has fully transitioned into a comfortable state, the response often becomes inconsistent. Not necessarily verbalized, but felt. Now, this is where communication through the body becomes critical again. If you are still present, still observing, you will notice when things feel aligned and when they don't. The solution is not complexity. It is slowness. And I do not mean hesitation. I mean controlled, intentional pacing that allows the body to gradually adapt. Think of it as giving the nervous system time to synchronize. When the pace is gentle at the beginning, the body does not resist. It adapts. It relaxes into the experience rather than trying to catch up to it. And as adaptation increases, responsiveness naturally improves. This is why, in many clinical observations, couples who slow their initial pacing often report a stronger overall connection later in the experience, because the body was not forced to adjust suddenly. It was guided gradually. Now, I want to clarify something important. Slowness is not weakness. It is control. And control, in this context, does not mean dominance. It means awareness of timing. A man who understands pacing is not simply moving differently. He is reading the room of the body correctly. And when you do this properly, something very interesting happens. Her body begins to respond more predictably. Not because it is being directed, but because it is being supported through its natural rhythm. So when you combine Technique 1 and Technique 2, you begin to see a pattern. First, you learn to observe. Then, you learn to adjust timing based on what you observe. This is where intimacy stops being guesswork, and it becomes coordination. In the next step, we will move into something even more subtle, where closeness itself becomes a form of communication. And physical connection is no longer just about movement, but about pressure, contact, and presence working together in a very controlled way. Once you reach this stage, something important becomes clear. Intimacy is no longer just about what you do. It is about how consistently you stay connected while you are doing it. And this brings us to the third principle. Technique 3 is often misunderstood because it is subtle. It does not look dramatic from the outside, but physiologically, it changes everything about how sensation is processed in the body. It is the principle of continuous contact combined with gentle, controlled pressure. Let me explain this in a simple clinical way. Most men focus heavily on movement as the primary driver of pleasure. But the human nervous system does not respond only to motion. It responds strongly to sustained contact, pressure, consistency, and predictable physical feedback. When contact is continuous, the body does not have to repeatedly reset its sensory awareness. Instead, it stays engaged in a stable state of stimulation. This stability is what allows deeper layers of sensation to build gradually rather than fluctuate. Now, in many long-term relationships, especially after many years together, a small but important habit develops. Movement becomes the main focus, while closeness sometimes decreases slightly without either partner noticing. Not because of lack of affection, but because attention shifts toward technique rather than connection. Clinically speaking, this can reduce the consistency of sensory input, which may lead to a less unified experience over time. Now, here is the important correction. When you maintain closer physical contact and when pressure remains steady rather than fragmented, the nervous system processes the experience in a more integrated way. This means internal and external sensory signals are no longer competing. They are working together. Research in relationship physiology has shown that combined stimulation patterns, meaning internal sensation supported by consistent external contact, are associated with higher reported satisfaction levels compared to isolated or disconnected patterns of stimulation. But I want to simplify this even further. It is not about doing more. It is about staying closer. There is a clinical story I often reference because it explains this perfectly. A long-term patient once described his experience in very straightforward terms. He said that over time, he felt things becoming less emotionally connected in his marriage, even though physically nothing major had changed. When we discussed his approach in detail, he realized something very subtle. He had developed a habit of maintaining slightly more physical distance than before, focusing mainly on rhythm rather than closeness. After adjusting just one thing, staying physically closer and maintaining consistent contact instead of frequent separation of movement, his experience changed noticeably. His exact words were simple. I didn't add anything new. I just stayed closer. And that one change shifted everything. This is the essence of this technique. Not intensity, not complexity, not force, but continuity. Because when physical contact remains stable, the nervous system does not have to constantly recalibrate. It remains in a smoother state of response. And when that happens, coordination improves naturally. You begin to feel her reactions more clearly, not because you are doing more, but because there is less interruption between signals. Her responses become easier to interpret. Your adjustments become more precise. And the overall interaction becomes more synchronized. At this point, something very important starts to develop between both partners. It is not just physical alignment anymore. It is shared rhythm. And once shared rhythm is established, everything that follows becomes significantly more natural. In the next step, we move into one of the most overlooked but scientifically interesting principles in intimacy. A brief, intentional pause that changes how the brain and body interpret sensation in real time and often enhances the overall intensity of the experience without increasing effort or complexity. At this stage, once closeness and continuous contact are understood, the next layer becomes far more subtle, but also very powerful when applied correctly. This is where we introduce Technique 4. And this principle is often overlooked, not because it is complicated, but because it feels counterintuitive at first. It is the strategic pause. Now, I want to be very precise here, because this is not about stopping completely, and it is not about breaking connection. It is about creating a very brief, controlled pause at the right moment while maintaining emotional and physical presence. Even a 1 to 2 second shift in rhythm can significantly change how the nervous system processes sensation. From a physiological perspective, this connects to how the brain handles expectation. When the body anticipates a familiar pattern, and that pattern is briefly interrupted in a controlled way, the brain responds by increasing attention and chemical activity linked to pleasure processing. In simple terms, the nervous system becomes more alert and more responsive when the rhythm resumes. This is not speculation. It is related to well-documented reward prediction mechanisms in neuroscience, where small interruptions in expected patterns can amplify perceived intensity when the pattern continues again. But in real-world practice, this is very simple. You are not trying to do anything dramatic. You are simply becoming aware of timing and choosing a brief moment of stillness when her body is already fully engaged and responsive. Usually, this is when breathing becomes deeper, movements become more synchronized, and the connection feels more stable between both partners. At that point, a short pause can shift the entire dynamic. And what is important here is how she responds. In many cases, the body naturally reacts to that pause by moving slightly closer, increasing contact, or holding tighter. Not because anything is being forced, but because anticipation and connection are temporarily intensified. This is where awareness matters more than technique. If the pause comes too early, before engagement is established, it will not have the same effect. If it comes too late, when the body is already reaching its peak response, it may disrupt flow instead of enhancing it. So timing is everything. And timing cannot be memorized. It has to be felt through observation. This is why the first principle we discussed is still essential here. Without reading her body, this technique loses its meaning. But when awareness and timing come together, the effect is very consistent. A brief pause becomes a signal of presence, not interruption. And in many clinical observations, this moment of controlled stillness often leads to a stronger reconnection when movement resumes, because both nervous systems are more synchronized. Now, I want to emphasize something important for older couples in particular. This technique does not rely on physical strength, endurance, or complexity. It relies entirely on awareness of rhythm. And that is something that can actually improve with age, not decline. Because experience allows you to recognize patterns more clearly. When used correctly, this principle does not create tension or confusion. It creates contrast. And contrast is what often deepens perception of sensation. Once this is understood, the final principle becomes even more meaningful because it explains how variation in movement and angle prevents the body from adapting too quickly, keeping responsiveness consistently engaged over time. In the next and final part, we will bring everything together into a complete system that focuses on rhythm, variation, emotional safety, and long-term connection. At this final stage, everything we have discussed begins to connect into one complete understanding of intimacy that is not based on guesswork, but on awareness, timing, and emotional presence working together. And this brings us to technique 5, which is variation in depth and angle. Now, this is something many long-term couples underestimate because familiarity creates a natural pattern, and over time, that pattern becomes predictable. But the nervous system is designed to respond strongly to variation, not repetition alone. When stimulation remains exactly the same for too long, sensory receptors gradually adapt. This is a normal neurological process called sensory adaptation. It does not mean anything is wrong. It simply means the body becomes less reactive to constant identical input. This is where small changes become important, not dramatic changes, not complicated techniques, but subtle shifts in depth, angle, and rhythm. Even minor adjustments can re-engage sensory pathways that had started to reduce their sensitivity to repetition. From a clinical perspective, research from sexual health studies has shown that varying stimulation patterns can significantly increase overall sensory responsiveness compared to a single repeated pattern. But in real life, this does not require technical expertise. It requires attention and responsiveness. For example, maintaining a steady, comfortable rhythm in the beginning allows the body to settle and become fully engaged. Then, as comfort increases, small variations naturally introduced in depth or angle can change how different sensory areas are activated. And then, when intensity builds, returning briefly to a slower rhythm allows the body to integrate that stimulation more deeply. This creates a natural wave-like pattern of response rather than a flat, repetitive one. And that wave-like pattern is often what people describe as feeling more connected and more emotionally engaging over time. What is particularly interesting in long-term relationships is that these small variations often reintroduce a sense of novelty, even after decades together. Not because the partner has changed, but because the experience itself is no longer predictable in a mechanical way. It becomes dynamic again. And I want to be very clear about something here. None of these principles are about replacing emotional connection with technique. In fact, the opposite is true. The deeper the emotional safety, the more responsive the body becomes. There is strong clinical evidence that emotional security directly influences physical responsiveness. When a person feels safe, understood, and emotionally relaxed with their partner, the nervous system becomes more open to pleasure responses. This means that intimacy is never just physical. It is always a combination of emotional tone, physical awareness, and timing. And in long-term couples, emotional safety often becomes the strongest foundation of all. Because without safety, the body holds back. With safety, it softens. I have seen this repeatedly in older couples I have worked with. Often, the most powerful changes did not come from changing physical technique alone, but from small shifts in emotional approach. A calmer tone, a slower pace, a moment of reassurance, a sense of patience instead of urgency. These simple elements change how the nervous system interprets the entire experience. And when emotional safety and physical awareness come together, everything becomes more natural, more synchronized, more connected, and far less effort-driven. So when you look at everything we have covered, you realize something important. It was never about complexity. It was about awareness. Reading her body, slowing down at the right time, staying physically close, using brief pauses with intention, and introducing gentle variation to maintain responsiveness. When all of this works together, intimacy stops feeling like performance. It becomes a shared rhythm between two people who understand each other's signals more clearly. And that is often what many couples rediscover later in life. Not something new, but something familiar they simply stopped noticing over time. My hope is that this guide helps you reconnect not just physically, but emotionally as well. Because age does not remove connection. It only changes the way it needs to be understood. And when it is understood correctly, many couples find that their later years are not a decline in intimacy, but actually a deeper, calmer, and more meaningful version of it.